August is the traditional time for a summer Pokémon Presents show. Are we likely to have one this year? And if so, what will it unveil? And why is there a decent chance it will show us a Pokémon game slated for release on Nintendo Switch on November the 21st, 2024? In this video, we are going to trawl through the release history of Pokémon titles, the history of Pokémon Presents videos, analyse the credits of some titles in the Pokémon series, and review Nintendo's scheduling to make some very specific forecasts about the Pokémon company's upcoming antics. So please hit the like and subscribe buttons, check out my brand new Patreon details below if you'd like to support this channel's work, and let's dive in. So, to start with, Nintendo Directs, and that includes the Directs of the Pokémon Company, are far from predictable. But it is striking that from 2021 onwards, there has been a rather regular pattern of Pokémon Directs. One is always on Pokémon Day, and we have had 4 of these in a row. The second in a year seems to take place around 6 months after, specifically in August. Generally, the first presentation is responsible for announcing titles. For example, February 2021 saw the announcement of Pokémon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, and Pokémon Legends Arceus, both on the same day. Then Pokémon Day 2022 announced Pokémon Scarlet and Violet. 2023 saw the reveal of the Scarlet and Violet DLC, and of course, February 2024 gave us the grand reveal of Pokémon Legends CA. There's no doubt that the big movement, the heavy lifting in terms of Pokémon reveals, is done by the February presentation, which, as well as being the anniversary and therefore having a bit of additional buzz that probably carries across the Pokémon product line and helps sell toys and games, also helpfully comes before the end of the financial year, and so probably helps assuage investors that the company is in good health going into its future. The August presentation is a newer innovation. 2021, 2022 and 2023 have all had them, but before then August was never a favoured date, and many years, notably 2016, 2017 and 2018, did not have multiple Pokémon Directs to their name at all. The August Directs generally focused on content that is not quite as significant as big games such as tournaments or revisions, particularly to their mobile titles, plus, of course, Nintendo Switch Online game releases. Last year's featured a major expose on Detective Pikachu Returns, a game that had been announced back in 2019 and had been radio silent until Nintendo's June 2023 Direct, and so it was a fairly big moment that the August presentation got to deep dive this title. Still, I would not deny that the history of these mid-year presentations is not littered with major announcements, and under any normal circumstances I would expect that if there were to be an August presentation at all, it would be a very quiet one. However, Pokémon is in an extremely unusual situation in 2024 because there are no console titles on the slate for the year at all. Yes, there's the mobile title. Yes, ZA will quite possibly be out this financial year, but we could be facing a holiday season without a retail Pokémon title, something that in other years would be completely unthinkable. Now, there have been light years before. 2020 had Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Rescue Team DX in March and Pokémon Cafe Remix in June, plus a healthy dose of DLC from Sword and Shield. 2015's releases were all in the spin-offy vein, but there were a lot. Pokémon Tournament, Pokémon Super Mystery Dungeon and Pokémon Picross all in the second half of the year. 2011's holiday offering was Poké Park 2 Wonders Beyond on the Wii, while 2010 didn't have a game for a Nintendo console in the holiday quarter, but it did have Pokémon Black and White in September 2010, in Japan at least, while the American holiday sales were taken care of by the release of Pokémon Ranger Guardian Signs. The last time a North American holiday season didn't have a retail Pokémon release was 2007, but since both Pokémon Diamond and Pearl and Pokémon Battle Revolution had released only a few months prior, an additional holiday title at that point would have been fairly unnecessary. As for the last year where not a single Pokémon retail title launched on a Nintendo system, Well, as friend of the channel at Talking Soccer reminded me in the comments last month, that was 1997, before a decent chunk of this channel's viewers were born. The point is, this is a historic lull in Pokemon games. It is almost unprecedented. So why the lull? There are 3 key reasons that might be identified, so let's look at them in turn. Possibility 1 is that they don't feel the need to continue releasing Pokemon titles on a system that is already heavily saturated with them. The Nintendo Switch boasts 2 generations, 2 remade generations, and multiple high-end spin-offs, including the innovative Legends game and its sequel, which is just around the corner. Why keep putting out Pokemon games under these circumstances when you can use your back catalogue to continue selling your previous titles? The thing is, though, you could say the same about another huge name Nintendo franchise, namely Mario. But Mario is taking quite a different approach. It tends to be the case that late console Mario output actually ticks up, and certainly this will be the 2nd consecutive year where the holiday window has included not 1 like normal, but 2 Mario releases. 2023 had Super Mario RPG and Super Mario Bros. Wonder, while 2024 has Super Mario Party Jamboree and Mario and Luigi Brothership. This makes sense when you realise that the Switch will soon be superseded as Nintendo's premier offering, but may have a long continued life as the cheaper secondary console, particularly being bought up by children. And with Mario being the company's iconic mascot, it makes all the sense in the world for Nintendo to up the release rate of Mario games. 2024 will be the first year when the Switch has boasted 4 retail Mario releases. The 3DS also did this once. When? Why, 2017, the year the console's card was marked as soon to be replaced by the neophyte Switch. I should also say that I'm only counting Heartland Mario titles, ones with Mario's name front and centre. Once you count Luigi's Mansion 2 HD and Princess Peach Showtime, this year has an even stronger mushroom flavour. Now, the same logic doesn't have to apply to Pokemon, but historically, it has. Black 2 and White 2 released not just late in the DS's life, but 16 months into the reign of the successor system, in a year which also featured the DS release of Pokémon Conquest. Late-era 3DS also had a fair showing of Poke products, with Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon in 2017, followed by Detective Pikachu a few months later in March 2018. Although it's fair to say in 2017 and 2018, Pokemon games were fairly diversified, with Magikarp Jump, Pikachu Talk and Pokemon Quest focusing on the mobile space, and Pokémon Tournament DX and Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee targeting the Nintendo Switch. Since the next Nintendo console is 90% certain to be backwards compatible, there's no reason for them to worry too much about splitting their attention between developing for Switch and developing for the sequel system. A second reason for there being a lull then, the delay of the next console, might have something to do with matters. But you wouldn't expect OG Switch titles to be relegated entirely given the Pokemon Company's history of sticking with veteran hardware over the shiny new thing. It seems, again, 90% likely that Pokemon Legends EA will be, at minimum, forwards compatible, if not cross-gen, and it could be that other titles they have in their lineup are straddling this divide as well, and that might have an effect on their decision-making. However, I think a third consideration must come into play, and that is game dev time. The Pokemon Company bootstrapped itself into being a major player on the video game scene through fairly small-scale handheld titles. None of the Pokemon generations have been technical marvels, and many have felt a little dated even by the standards of their own generation, but they're not producing for an 8-bit monochrome system anymore. The Switch, let alone its successor, does require a large input of time, and that makes life harder for developers. After 2018's Great Detective Pikachu on 3DS, it was 5.5 years before Creatures was able to put out the sequel title. Yes, there was a pandemic in between, but all the same, we're not talking about Breath of the Wild or Metroid Prime 4. This was a relatively small-scale spin-off adventure which was graphically fairly pedestrian for the console it launched on. But even pedestrian graphics for Switch mean HD visuals and that means a higher investment in terms of time. The rest of the Pokémon spin-off library on Switch seems to have grouped itself into a few baskets. There are mobile crossover titles like Pokémon Unite and Pokémon Cafe Mix. Assuming nothing bigger comes out, some kind of small-scale Pokémon puzzler has to be a 30% chance before the end of the year, and if Tetris 99 and F-Zero 99 could get retail releases, if only in a limited way, then you have to imagine that, let's say, Pokémon Yellow 99 could also get massive numbers if such a game were to release. Then there are high-budget titles like Pokémon Tournament and New Pokémon Snap, both shepherded by one of the teams at Bandai Namco. However, it would be ambitious to imagine that Bandai Namco would be ready to put out another game of scale less than 3 years after the release of New Pokémon Snap. And why wouldn't the Pokémon Company task one of their most graphically capable studios with something for the next console instead? Then there's Pokémon Mystery Dungeon, another one that would be promising as a potential release if not for a few complicating factors. Spike Chunsoft's return to Pokémon Mystery Dungeon came in the form of a remake in 2020, and we know how these things usually work on Nintendo when they want to dust off franchises that haven't been around for a while. First a remake, and then, a few years later, a new title. That was the pattern with Metroid Prime, Famicom Detective Club, plus 2D Metroid and Zelda, if you count Samus Returns. Actually, in Mystery Dungeon's case, it had only been just over 4 years since the prior release, which means that now would be the longest interval since a Pokémon Mystery Dungeon title has released. Are Spike Chunsoft overdue? Well, yes, 2024 would make a perfect launch window for a new Pokémon Mystery Dungeon game, and indeed, they have delivered some Mystery Dungeon antics, in the form of Shiren the Wanderer, the Mystery Dungeon of Serpent Coil Island, blasting onto Switch this January. Developer Spike Chunsoft also put out a survey earlier this year asking which games audiences would like to see sequels to, and Pokémon Mystery Dungeon did not even merit a mention. Now, granted, Pokémon Mystery Dungeon isn't in their gift to commission, so it would be pointless in that sense to ask about it, and while having a major Mystery Dungeon title launch this year might augur poorly for a new Pokémon spin-off, Spike Chunsoft is a fairly large and diversified company. It has over 200 employees, and you only need to look at Team Ninja for an example of another company which can put out multiple similar kinds of games, both with Nintendo licenses and without, in the form of their Warriors titles. Still, about 30 different people who worked on Pokémon Mystery Dungeon for the Switch went on to develop on Shiren, and it included the directors of the last 2 Pokémon Mystery Dungeon titles, Shinichi Hirotomi and Hironori Ishigami, both of them in senior positions, not just in a consultative role. Still, Pokémon Mystery Dungeon didn't do too badly. According to a 2022 chart of sellers, it scooped a worldwide total of 1.82 million copies by that point, which is roughly in line with what Shigeru Miyamoto has identified as his central expectation for what a game should sell to basically be fine, that being about 2 million. But given how many fingers are wanting a slice of the Pokemon pie, my hunch is that the profits were not overwhelming for any individual group involved, and it all bodes a little poorly for a new Pokémon Mystery Dungeon game. So we have the fact of the title seemingly being overdue against lots of mitigating factors, and remembering that Pokémon Rangers and other spin-offs have withered away in recent years at this point, my hunch is that a new Pokémon Mystery Dungeon launching by the end of 2025 is just a 30% chance. I've spent a fair bit of time talking about Pokémon Mystery Dungeon because if there is to be an announcement for this year, a smaller spin-off title might make the most sense. We have Pokémon Legends ZA next year, and there has to be around a 70% chance, given how incredibly schedule-bound the series has always been, that Gen 10 will also release by the end of 2025, with the only reason for doubt being that February 2026 will be the series' 30th anniversary, making a Gen 10 release by the end of March 2026 a 90% shout to my way of thinking. What else is there to release? Creatures are unlikely to revive Pokemon Rangers, given they've only just put out Detective Pikachu Returns, but of course they could easily contract out work on a remake of a previous game, and so it could be that a studio we don't even normally associate with Pokemon are involved. Perhaps this could be another Forever Entertainment project, for example. And then there is the tantalizing case of Ilka, who worked on 2021's Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, and are, as I have covered in a separate video, quite likely to be working on Mario and Luigi Brothership. It's a large and diversified team again, so it is certainly possible that they could have another game on the slate for 2024. I have mentioned previously my theory that, although the chances are low, they are slightly underrated of the Pokemon Company not going straight to a Gen 5 remake, but going instead to an HD remaster of Gen 6, given that the 3DS games might make for an easier transition to Switch, and it would tie more directly into the new Pokemon Legends title. Still, the lack of any indication that this is in the offering has made me think that it was unlikely to happen. Another possible game that could be shipped out in 2024 would be, of course, another Let's Go title. Game Freak developed the first one internally, but with the game engine already in place, it might make sense to contract out the sequel, and given 3 years, Ilka could probably have taken this on. It would definitely be a big seller on the huge Switch install base against the backdrop of a light Pokemon year. 3 years is usually the magic window of time to develop games of this nature, and there is still a gap in the 2024 holiday release schedule. Mario and Luigi Brothership releases on the 7th of November 2024, and after that, from Nintendo there is nothing until January. Now, usually the biggest title, very often a Pokemon title, is released the week before the American Thanksgiving holiday, and if we assume Nintendo will continue their recent trend of releasing on Thursdays, that means there is a slot going begging on the 21st of November 2024. It's not always used. In fact, in 2017 it was not used. Not by the Switch at any rate. But it is a very plum sales spot. Usually Nintendo gives its titles 3 weeks of breathing room, and there would only be 2 weeks after Brothership releases, but things are often different in the holiday season, when a 2-week window usually seems to be fine. It seems surprising to me, therefore, that there is nothing in this fantastic spot, and we know that the Pokemon Company usually like to have their flag in the ground of that pre-Black Friday game. Just on gut instinct, it feels really implausible to me that the Pokemon Company would skip this holiday, but that's not to say they would necessarily have a particularly major game to show for themselves. Could it have been that Pokemon Legends ZA was their holiday title, and that the purported behind-the-scenes delay of Switch 2 meant that the title wasn't able to release after all? It's possible, but a 3-year development window has proved tight for Game Freak until now, and with Legends Arceus releasing at the end of January, that means Pokemon Legends ZA's dev time would have been 2 months shorter even than that. Besides, the Brothership date would have been pinned down long after the decision to adjust the Switch 2 release timeframe was decided, and Nintendo still decided to leave in that gap in the schedule. That suggests to me that that gap is intended to be filled, or at least there's a very strong chance it is. A lot of forecasting is trying to take the outside-in view. Generally, the Pokemon Company puts big games in the holiday window. Generally, Nintendo fills the Black Friday slot. And generally, if the Pokemon Company and Game Freak have built up a relationship with a company like Ilka, it's unlikely that this relationship will be broken, when, for all its issues in terms of critical reception, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl were clearly big successes for the companies. So taking the outside-in view, there are an awful lot of reasons to think that this holiday will have a Pokemon game, and possibly a Pokemon game of fairly big significance. So I guess what is obscuring matters is the fact that there is no real precedent for the Pokemon Company saving a big reveal for late on. Here's the thing though, Pokemon Day had a major announcement in Pokemon Legends ZA. The Pokemon Company has the scope to reveal more about that at the time Nintendo announces the successor to the Nintendo Switch. Of course, they could also show some material before, but it might be harder to do if they really want to show the graphical power of the new game. That puts an August presentation on a slightly weaker footing already, if it's not completely certain, whether they will do a further deep dive into the new Legends title. Now, if you had announced 2 big titles in February, ZA and a holiday game, you would get one big push of news in which ZA is clearly going to be the bigger title. It's going to be more exciting than another Let's Go game or even another remake. Now, putting 2 game announcements together can work sometimes. For example, 2021 announced Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl and Pokémon Legends Arceus together in one massive hit. But I would say that there were very compelling reasons to do that in that instance. Specifically, that it was the 25th anniversary of Pokémon and that Legends Arceus was a new concern and a little experimental. Also, people had hyped up Gen 4 remakes to the point where they must have been cognizant that there was a real risk people would feel underwhelmed by the remake announcement alone, so doing it as a 1-2 punch benefited both titles. The situation is very different now. ZA would have eclipsed anything else in hype terms, but a short announcement to release window can do quite well for a company. It saves on advertising, it pleases Nintendo who like to keep things close to their chest, and there is some recent precedent, sort of. Detective Pikachu Returns had been announced in 2019, but it had been 4 years radio silent before the June Direct announced the game. Now, nothing Pokémon was announced in the June 2024 Direct, but we can see from the announcement of the new Famicom Detective game, Emio the Smiling Man, that the Direct is not the only venue Nintendo sees as fitting to release information about its new titles, and a Pokémon Presents would be a logical space for something new in the Pokémon field. Given how packed the last Nintendo Direct was, it only makes sense that if they did have a Pokémon title to announce, they would hold it back for its own separate presentation. There is one final piece of evidence that, to me, suggests a bigger Pokémon title is likely this year. Nintendo has forecast that it will move 13.5 million Nintendo Switch consoles by the end of the 2024 to 2025 financial year. That is a massive amount of aging hardware to shift, and would need to be driven primarily by those big megaton games. Super Mario Party Jamboree will do great numbers, absolutely, and because it seems to be a title focused heavily on multiplayer gaming, it may encourage some people to pick up additional Switch consoles. I will also mention here that while Nintendo YouTube has been on the train broadly that the new Joy-Con dock is presaging a new era of a sequel console that uses Joy-Cons but can't connect to them, I find a simpler explanation for this new piece of tech is that it's been designed to encourage Super Mario Party Jamboree players to purchase it alongside and to buy spare Joy-Con at the same point so that they can have larger play sessions with larger numbers of people. After all, it's being released alongside Super Mario Party Jamboree, and while the Switch has always had the capacity for very large numbers of people to play, it's something they've only really started pushing as a significant game mode with Everybody Won to Switch last year, and that would not have been the most promising vehicle to sell a piece of spin-off hardware. Still, if Super Mario Party Jamboree is geared towards selling not primarily Switch consoles, but additional hardware, where are these 13.5 million consoles going to come in? Now, The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom will also sell consoles, especially with the special edition Switch Lite that's coming out, but the other surefire way to sell a special edition console is, and has always been, Pokémon. Yes, they could do variant switches around the new Legends title before the end of the financial year, but if that's going on to the successor console as well, that might not be the most opportune time to sell a variant of the OG Switch. The time for them to strike, I would say, is this holiday season. Obviously, the longer we go without an announcement, the less likely one is, and really August to September is the last chance I could see one happening. I think there is a 70% chance there will be another Pokémon Presents this year, and probably 50% it happens in August, given the recent trends. It feels to me that there has to be at least a 50% chance of a new retail title for Pokémon, probably for that 21st of November slot. And at this point, I think the Pokémon Company and Nintendo are in go big or go home territory. I would still put it at 30% that it would be a title of some more significance than a puzzly spin-off, and probably a fairly substantial piece of work, maybe even by Ilka. So we're talking Let's Go 2, another remake, or a Rangers remake perhaps. The field is very open. Of course, there is another option, which is that they do have a Pokemon release that is fairly substantial, but completely left field. I'm reminded of 2020, when Mario Kart Live Home Circuit raced into people's living rooms, a Mario game that I don't think anybody was expecting at that point. I'm also reminded of Umbrella's virtual pet game, Hey You Pikachu, for the N64 back in 1998, a concept that feels massively overdue a return for Pokemon. I'm not sure in this case who would be able to put together a Pokemon Pet Simulator for Nintendo, given that Umbrella, the developers of the N64 title, was disbanded and absorbed into Creatures in 2020, and since Creatures are working on the Pokemon trading card game as well as having just put out Detective Pikachu, I can't see them getting the nod, but it could well be a new developer, and heck, although I downgraded earlier the chance of Bandai Namco coming through, there is a slim chance they could put something out that is either a revival of an old concept or something rather new. Pokemon Pet Simulators, racing games, tower defense, or how about this? A Switch version of the Pokemon trading card game that was announced for mobile. There have to be a lot of options on the table for the Pokemon Company, although if we're thinking of titles that will shift not just games but consoles, then surely the virtual pet route is one of the most promising ones, short of a major remake. I will confess that while I'm a huge fan of Nintendo, I'm less an aficionado of Pokemon. I've enjoyed some of the games, but I don't follow it nearly as closely. When I analysed Pokemon previously, I've had a bit of pushback, which is fine, and people raise some great points, but hopefully I've laid out the logic of my forecasts clearly, and I will be interested in seeing people's contributions who are very wired in to Pokemon news to offer their perspectives. Additionally, I am in the process of setting up the Nintendo Forecast Patreon, and while there'll be more on this soon, if you enjoy what I do and want to consider supporting the channel, please do check that out in the description box below. In the meantime, there are videos on screen which have you covered for more content. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon for another Nintendo Forecast.